Hello, I'm David Pendergrass, and you are watching the final video for the study of how to read the Bible for all it's worth. I want to say at the very beginning, thank you for watching, and at the very end, I'm going to say some more encouraging words, and thank you for the great work you've done on this 13-week study. Let's look very quickly and very briefly at chapter 13, the Revelation, Images of Judgment and Hope. If you'll remember, we have talked about through this study many times about different literary types or genres. There's Psalms, wisdom literature, Gospels, history or the book of Acts, different histories in the Old Testament, and so forth. We've discovered some of them, we've explored some of the major genres or literary types. And remember, that's the very first thing we need to do in interpretation. You and I remember, and please help your D group members think about this at the very beginning of this study for this week. You and I do this instinctively. We instinctively think about different genres every day, all the time. We do it all the time. When I pick up How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, I don't read it like I do a John Grisham novel. If I pick up the newspaper, I don't read an editorial in the newspaper like I do the comic books, comic section. I don't read the editorial like I would a cookbook. Let's say, for example, I'm talking to my friend Jeff, and Jeff and I are looking over this literature, this book, and Jeff says, "Hey, David, what are you reading?" And I said, "Well, I'm reading this stuff. It's really great. It's called poetry, and it talks about this guy's in love." And Jeff picks up and goes, "Poetry? What's poetry?" He flips through the page and he says, "Well, the guy says something about a butterfly in his stomach and feeling butter. That's disgusting. He eats butterflies?" I go, "Well, no, Jeff. No, he didn't eat butterflies. It's an expression. It's a metaphor. That is, it's a little flickering. It's the feeling of adrenaline that comes when we have anxiety or nervousness because we're excited about it." And he goes, No. Butterflies? It says right here in the text, butterflies in the stomach." To which I say, "It does say that, Jeff, and just repeating the words butterflies over and over doesn't mean it's literal butterflies, no matter how much I repeat the word butterflies." And Jeff goes, "But it says butterflies in the stomach." Now, Jeff, wait a second. Do you know about what poetry is? And Jeff goes, "What's poetry?" I said, "Well, Jeff, poetry is a genre. It's a literary type. It's a kind of writing in literature where you express things in certain ways that is different from prose. It's different from declarative statements and so forth and literal descriptions. You don't read it like you do a science textbook or a cookbook or whatever. There's full of metaphors and similes and symbolism, and it's meant to evoke emotions and feelings and reflection. It's meant to evoke that. And so you can't get caught up in the words used. You have to get caught up in what it evokes." And Jeff looks at you and goes, "Well, I think this is ridiculous because it says butterflies." Now, that analogy is a little bit comical, but it's comical because it's so true. Imagine for a second that you had that exact conversation with someone who's never heard of poetry. Well, the problem is that's what happens to us today. There is a genre, a literary type, like my friend Jeff, he didn't know what poetry meant. There is a kind of literary style called apocalypse that you and I no longer encounter. It's a literary style that's dead. So imagine, just like Jeff in my analogy, who never heard of this newfangled poetry. If I said, "Jeff, poetry is a really old form of writing they used to use all the time back then, a couple thousand years ago." That's what apocalypse is. Apocalyptic literature is a specific kind of genre, just like gospel is one, or biography, or history, or cookbook, or newspaper editorial. They're all literary types. The reason why Revelation is so bizarre to us and usually misinterpreted and misapplied is because it's a kind of literary style that we no longer use. And so people aren't familiar with it. And so they read it like it's just a free-for-all. Well, in scholarship, and you can too, in scholarship we study this. In the ancient world, Revelation fits nicely into a pattern of literary style called apocalyptic, like I've said, apocalypse. And there were many Jewish apocalyptic works, and there were many Christian apocalyptic works. You can read almost all of them, if not all of them, in English translations. and there you can buy a reader that's cheap. I have one. You can borrow it, and you can read about 30 or parts of 30 different apocalypses, both Jewish and Christian. Um, I had a PhD class on apocalyptic literature. In the very first half of the semester, we did nothing but read and analyze other apocalyptic works. And then the last half of the semester, I was kind of nervous. I thought we were going to run out of time. But it was very effective, because by the time we got to after the half of the semester, and then we got to Revelation, it looked so easy to read. It was no longer daunting. I just got it because I'd read all the other kind of styles. Again, by analogy, if I read Robert Frost and Dickens and on, and if I read all these poets and then read one little thing on poetry, it would be a lot easier to read. Well, Revelation is like that, and it's Revelation, not Revelations. It's called Revelation, or the Apocalypse of John. Apocalypse, we'll talk about in a little bit, but it is a bizarre one. Now, Revelation, as we have it, was a popular book in the ancient world. In the ancient world, it was popular primarily in the West. In Asia Minor, many in the Orthodox tradition did not accept the Apocalypse of John as canonical. That is, they didn't want it in their Bible. There's another apocalypse called the Apocalypse of Peter that was more popular, all the way to, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, that's in Asia Minor primarily, it wasn't until, if I understand correctly, the early 800s before the Apocalypse of John was finally admitted into their canon, until they finally said, okay, it is Scripture. But for most of the Western Church, they accepted the Apocalypse of John early on as should be part of the Bible, and no other apocalypses. Like I said, there were others at the time, the Shepherd of Hermas, and others, the Sibylline Oracles, the Apocalypse of Peter. There were several really popular Christian apocalypses that were circulating in Asia Minor and all through the Roman Empire. But the Apocalypse of John won the day as the one that made it into what we call the Bible. Revelation is really three different genres wrapped into one. Three different genres wrapped into one. And it's a letter, it is a prophecy, and it's an apocalypse. Now, I'm going to say something very briefly about these, and you can explore these more in your D group. One, the document, Apocalypse of John, is a letter. It starts out as a letter, it ends as a letter. He's writing to actual churches in Asia Minor at the end of the first century. John, a real human, is writing to actual churches in an actual Asia Minor at the end of the first century. Any interpretation you ever read that has the churches represent huge metaphorical other things has misinterpreted a letter. When John wrote this, he did not write this to other Christians about other metaphorical things. He's writing to actual physical church communities in Asia Minor, of which we have proof of their existence. We have archaeological proof that these churches existed. So letters matter, which means, again, like with Paul's letters and James and John, historical context matters. When he writes to the church in Ephesus, what was going on in Ephesus at the end of the first century? When he writes to Patmos and so forth, we look these cities up in good Bible dictionaries, good Bible commentaries. They'll help us understand why he said what he said. And there's so much more there, but I move on. Number two, it's not just a letter format, it's a prophecy. It's what he considers it to be, a prophecy. Now, I talked about this with the biblical prophets way back in the Old Testament. But you remember, a prophet is not just one who just tells the future. A prophet is one who speaks a word for God. He's an oracle. He's just a mouthpiece of God. If right now Mackie ran to the door and said, David, Paul needs you right now, and I would say he's being a prophet. He's speaking on behalf of someone else. Well, John thinks that's what he is. I'm speaking on behalf of God. And what he speaks on behalf of God has a lot to do with the here and now, and it has some to do with the future, just like the ancient biblical prophets. Mostly it's about the here and now, somewhat about the future, but it is a prophecy. Again, he's giving a prophetic talk to actual churches in Asia Minor. Thirdly, it's an apocalypse, and this is where, again, it's an unfamiliar genre, but apocalypse is a full-blown literary type. Here are some key features of apocalypse. So when scholars classify a document and say, this is poetry, this is prose, this is a history, this is an apocalypse, there are certain features of apocalyptic literature that all New Testament scholars have, on which they have consensus. One is apocalyptic authors used Old Testament texts for their primary source or foundation of images, such as Ezekiel 40 to 48, Daniel 7 to 12, Zechariah 1 to 6, and segments of Isaiah. That is, you can't really understand Revelation or any apocalyptic literature unless you understand those Old Testament texts. And yes, that would take a long time to look up every reference, because he references in Revelation hundreds, I think it's over 500 allusions to the Old Testament. So he knew his Old Testament very well, and he uses them as a bag of resources to apply metaphors and images. He doesn't always use it the same, but he does use it as a source. And I'm going to say here, right here, you cannot fully understand Revelation without studying these prophetic foundations. Moreover, since this literature began in moments of crisis or oppression, apocalyptic authors kept the emphasis upon judgment and salvation. That's what the Old Testament prophets did. They just typically postpone those into the future when it's all oppression would cease. So what apocalyptic authors did, like John the prophet, what he did, like the old prophets, was he kept the message about judgment and salvation and hope. What he said did something differently than what they did in the Old Testament. They talked about judgment and hope right then in their times, with very rare exception. John and other apocalyptic authors, they say it is about salvation and hope, but it's about a salvation and hope that will only come when the entire world is done away with and there's a brand new heavens and new earth. So it postpones the final consummation. It postpones the final defeat of the enemies and the final victory of all God's people. Letter B, this genre deliberately uses visions and dreams to convey the message because the author has been given an otherworldly vision. Now, we all get this because we've all, I guess all of us, have had dreams. And you wake up from a dream and someone says, well, describe your dream to me. Some people can never remember their dreams. I can oftentimes, and a lot of times most people can. But when you try to describe it, isn't it true when you try to describe it, you can remember some details and some things that happen. Now, some dreams are real vivid, but most of the time the dreams, you only remember part of them, and it's kind of fuzzy. You kind of remember certain images, and well, you were there, but I don't remember what you were wearing, but you were there, and so-and-so was there. We were in some room, it was kind of white, I don't remember. But in our dream, though, it seems so clear. But when we're trying to describe it, it sounds otherworldly. Apocalyptic literature, in our book called Revelation, is just like that. It's a vision, or it's dreamlike. It's dreamlike, which means he's deliberately using things of like a dream to explain it, which means it's kind of fuzzy, as it were. Now, the word apocalypse in Greek means revelation or unveiling. If someone said, describe to me your dream, and I described it, I would say, you gave me an apocalypse. You revealed or you unveiled your dream, your vision. And that's what it means. That's why we call it the apocalypse of John. It just means the unveiling. As if the heavens or the heavenly realms we could just unzip it and pull back the layer and see the supernatural realm. If that were to happen, you could not say, oh, it's just like that tree. It's just like that so-and-so. You couldn't. You would be forced to use, that's the next one, metaphors, images, numbers, wild images, to try to express how otherworldly that world is. And apocalyptic literature, especially Revelation. In fact, Revelation has more vivid images probably than any other apocalyptic work that exists. It loves to say things that just sound crazy to us. It does not like to describe things at face value. Most of the time, if you read Revelation as a face value description, oh, a grasshopper with a scorpion's tail. Okay. How long was it? 3.6 meters. We've missed the point. We've missed it because that's not how apocalyptic literature works. Again, if I said butterflies in your stomach, ugh, and I go, no. That's not how poetry works. You've misread poetry. And I'm saying that you and I have misread apocalyptic works if we're trying to always squeeze it down to a face value description. There are genres that like face value descriptions, like biography or law. Don't eat pork, don't eat this. That's not a metaphor, it's saying don't eat it. Well, that's a different genre. In apocalyptic literature, it's different. So beasts with 7 heads and 10 horns, a woman clothed with the sun, locusts with scorpions' tails and human heads. Okay. So the point is, like with poetry, typically, pay attention to how the image makes you feel rather than the exact physical description. Do you go, ugh, or oh my goodness, or that's gross, or that's ridiculous? Whatever you feel, whatever it evokes for you, then stay with that. The problem is, a lot of the images used in Revelation don't evoke things in us anymore because we're 2,000 years removed in a different language and different culture removed. So books and teachers have to explain it, and then just like it was explained to me at one time, and then when they're explained, you go, oh, I get it. Well, then we've missed the point. It's the same thing every time my wife sees me laughing at a show and goes, what was funny about that? By the time I describe it, I've dissected the frog. It's not funny anymore by the time I say why it was funny. Unfortunately, that's how it works with apocalyptic literature and parables typically too. I go, oh, okay, well then it's not funny, or it's not, I didn't evoke awe in me anymore because I go, oh, a star means this, but nevertheless, we do what we can. So it deliberately uses Old Testament text as the major source from where it gets its metaphors and images and symbols. It deliberately describes a visionary or dreamlike state, and it deliberately uses symbolism, metaphors, numbers, and wild images to keep this otherworldly vision described. Number 2, understanding time. Apocalyptic literature is not concerned with giving detailed chronology, contrary to nearly every popular interpretation. That is a mishandling of apocalyptic literature. If you said, I want to read a detailed chronology for a cookbook, you would do well. Because when it says 25 minutes at 350 degrees, it's not a metaphor. It's not a parable. It's not a symbol. It means 25 minutes. 25 divisions of 60 seconds. Or multiples of 60 seconds. In apocalyptic literature, it's not that way. If you say, no, it says 25 minutes, it says butterflies, you've misread the literature. Instead, that's not how visions and dreams work, right? It's not how they work. So we don't try to force revelation into a time scheme. To do so is to greatly distort and misinterpret the genre. Now, there can be some basic movements of time, but if we get hard and fast with it, we probably almost certainly misinterpreting it. Here's there are many, many outlines of Revelation, many of them. There's one I find the most compelling, and I've looked at many of them. The one I find most compelling is by a former professor of mine, a New Testament scholar named Charles Talbert, who teaches at Baylor University. And this is straight from him. And I find it by far the most compelling. You see, very beginning, Revelation 1 to 3:22 is about the prophet's call and those letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And then we have something that would be described as 7 scenes, 7 descriptions of the same kind of thing. And very briefly, because I don't have time now, all Christians that we know about in the early church, in the ancient world, and of course today as well, we would say time is divided in 2 major sections. You have this present evil age where we're at. There's going to be a dividing line of judgment, and then the world to come. Okay, in simple schema. Present world, ancient and present world, it's evil and corrupt. There's going to be a judgment day, and then the world to come. Right before the dividing line, and maybe a little bit right after, but right before it, all apocalyptic authors said it's going to get worse and worse and worse. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars and pestilence and droughts and famines, and just hell will break loose right before the end. That's how they always talked. That's how Jesus talked in Mark 13 and so forth. That's how Revelation is concerned. That's what Paul talks about. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. Dr. Talbert suggests that, and a couple other scholars do as well, that what we have in Revelation is 7 different scenes of right around that dividing line, the shift of the ages, the shift of the ages. So if this cup had 7 different sides to it, maybe it's not a good analogy, but I'm a book. That's got 6 sides? Oh, a bunch more if you do the top bottom. Anyway, so if I say it's one book and I'm saying this is one side, I'm going to give you a description. I'm going to go, dook. I'm going to describe the same book. And I'm dook, same book, same book, same book. Every time I'm turning it, I'm giving a different description of the same book. Okay? Dr. Talbert said that he thinks that what we have is 7 different scenes, descriptions of the same event, and that is the shift of the ages. I think he's right. Now, there's so much more to that. You can look at his commentary. His commentary I have at the very bottom, page 59. It's called The Apocalypse, a reading of the Revelation of John. I think it's the best book out there on Revelation, and it's short and sweet. He's very concise. Ben Witherington III's book, Revelation, is really good. And Craig Hill's book, In God's Time, the Bible in the Future, is not a commentary on Revelation, but it has a lot of really good and scholarship, very common sense, consensus views of how to understand apocalyptic works. So there's more there, but that's where we're going to stop there on that point in the outline. Number 3, the purpose of Revelation. What is the purpose? Well, he never tells us exactly, but there are some themes like a drum he hits over and over and over again. And most scholars would say these 2 things. One, he wrote Revelation to encourage Christians to keep their faith in the face of suffering, which is on its way. Now, some Christians were going through suffering, but a lot of it was coming. And he repeatedly says, for those who endure to the end, or to those who conquer, to those who conquer. The Greek word for conquer is nikeo. The word for conqueror is Nike. It's actually pronounced Nikki. That's where we get the female name Nikki. So the shoe Nike means conqueror, one who is victorious. And it's constantly through Revelation like a beating drum. So stay faithful. Number 2, to encourage Christians to stay pure, faithful to Christian practices in the face of a seductive, sinful culture. Now you tell me if those points 1 and 2 don't apply to us today. Of course, there's so much more here. Now, I did a study on Revelation here at the church last year, and I have a packet of all the outlines I use and a recording of every single session besides the first one. And I can get a copy to you if you want. And I cover it in great detail. And I'm sure in the future I might do it again. It's a fun book to cover. That's all, folks. I want to say that a couple things. One is, I'm proud of you. Thank you for taking the time to wade through this material. For some of you, I know it was more demanding than others, and I appreciate you having the courage and the tenacity to stay in there and keep doing your work, because it has been paying off. It has been paying off. I appreciate the hard work you put into it. I appreciate your care for loving your people well. I've hoped this all along. I've prayed for this. Before I even got here, I prayed for this. That this study has helped change you and change your people in your D group. I hope it radically changed the way you've read the Bible, if you needed the changing. I hope that you apply these things. I hope that you will go back, you'll keep your notebook. I hope you'll go back and use these things, especially if you're a D group leader or a teacher. If you're covering, say you're going to cover the book of Acts, I hope you go back and reread what we covered in Acts. If you're covering an Old Testament text about Joseph, make sure you cover those things. Go back and reread it. I hope this becomes a really useful notebook for you. If you have any questions, if there's any way I can help you, you know to let me know. God bless you. Thank you for all the work you've done. I look forward to seeing you real soon.